Back to the here and now with Joe Coburn.
Rishi Sunak's at the COVID inquiry. Tomorrow, it's the crunch vote on Rwanda. Is this his toughest week since becoming Prime Minister? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the Conservative MP, Nick Fletcher, Labour's Shadow Schools Minister, Catherine McKinnell, Deputy Opinion Editor at the Financial Times, Miranda Green, and the writer and broadcaster, Timandra Harkness. On the programme today, the Prime Minister tells the COVID inquiry about the downsides of lockdown.
There were a range of impacts. Many of them socio-economic, the impact on children's education, on mental health, on the issue in the criminal justice system, as well as the pure economic impact.
He'll also be questioned over his Eat Out to Help Out plan, which has been criticised by other witnesses.
This is exactly encouraging what we've been trying to suppress and get on top of in the last few months. So it didn't feel sensible to me.
It would have been prudent for them to have thought about discussing it before it was launched.
I'm here at the COVID inquiry where the Prime Minister is under oath answering questions about some of these claims that have been raised by other witnesses so far.
It comes as Rishi Sunak faces intense pressure over plans to send illegal migrants to Rwanda.
I don't believe this bill will work. I think it will lead to a range of legal claims which will bog down our scheme and will not create the deterrent that he and I set out to achieve.
If we can pass the legislation that we'll introduce this week, the 99.5% of challenges by people who've been illegally trafficked here would fail.
I'm here in Westminster, where MPs who are critical of the government's plans are meeting to decide whether to back Rishi Sunak's bill or not.
Yes, so the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is under the spotlight today and tomorrow, and so is his leadership. You just heard there that dozens of his Conservative backbenchers are meeting to decide whether to back his Rwanda bill. But let's start with Rishi Sunak at the COVID inquiry, answering questions about his role as Chancellor during the pandemic. He was asked about his time and the decisions he made and was part of with the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson. Let's listen to a little bit of what he said.
As a senior cabinet minister, one of the consistent arguments or points that I made from the beginning throughout was just making sure that we collectively in the Prime Minister considered the totality of the impacts of the decisions that we were making. It wasn't, I didn't ever describe it as a clash just between public health and economics. I think that's to think about it in far too narrow a way. As many people have alluded to, and I did at the time, there were a range of impacts. Many of them socio-economic, the impact on children's education, on mental health, on the issue in the criminal justice system, as well as the pure economic impact. And it was important that policymakers consider the totality of those, and that was a consistent point throughout.
Let's talk to our political correspondent, Ione Wells, who's outside the inquiry. Ione, what have you made of what Rishi Sunak has said so far?
I think what's been quite interesting about his appearance at the inquiry so far, compared to some of the other witnesses that we've heard from so far in this inquiry, is the kind of lack of big headline-grabbing statements, really. I think he's been asked repeatedly about things like how well different ministers and different advisors communicated, also things like whether he was able to have his view heard as well, and also the broader culture in Downing Street at the time. And he's actually kind of defended the response so far on all those fronts. He said that he felt that communication was effective and that most communications were recorded in the official way, that he was able able to be heard properly and that ministers had good and healthy debate about key issues. He's also said that he doesn't really recognise reports of a sort of toxic culture in Downing Street, although he does acknowledge that he wasn't working in number 10 itself, even though he was working closely with the Prime Minister and his office, of course, being his neighbour in number 11 Downing Street. But I think that's what's been striking so far, has been a relatively calm tone compared to some of the quite punchy statements that we've had from other witnesses who have taken direct aim at some of their colleagues at the time, criticising their approach and some of their decision-making.
I mean, in terms of specific schemes, he will be known and remembered for the furlough scheme, paying people's wages during the pandemic, and also Eat Out to Help Out, which we heard in the headlines. A lot of people have passed comment on.
That's right. I think certainly, I mean, that is the slogan that is on many of the protesters' signs here today at the inquiry. There will be questions asked about Eat Out to Help Out and about, as you say, the furlough scheme. But I think we should remember as well that the Chancellor's role during that period was, of course, much broader than that. It wasn't just some of these specific schemes. He was also the person in charge of, for example, deciding who would be eligible for self-isolation payments and things like that. There was also kind of broader questions about how much or not he was arguing for kind of lesser lockdown restrictions at certain periods during that decision-making process. So I think these will all be things that he is asked about going forward.
We'll talk to you a little bit later in the programme. Ione Wells there outside the inquiry. Miranda, perhaps I can start with you, having watched the evidence over the past few weeks. It's interesting seeing Rishi Sunak, now Prime Minister, then Chancellor. It was so different for him then. He was handing out money. He was popular, dare I say it, during the pandemic at a very difficult time for the nation. And here he is at Prime Minister, probably thinking about other things, being asked for his role in what went on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your point was a really good one, Jo, that in fact he would like to be remembered for the furlough scheme, which kept a lot of families, a lot of workers and a lot of businesses on the straight and narrow during the first lockdown and beyond. But unfortunately, the inquiry is trying to work out what was mishandled so that in the event, God forbid, of another similar pandemic situation, mistakes are not repeated. And that puts him on the spot over this Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which it seems was not particularly run past the scientists who might have raised problems with it. I mean, it's very difficult for Sunak, though, because I think with this issue, as with his horrors this week over the Rwanda bill and immigration, he has to play to lots of different audiences. You know, he quite enjoyed telling the Spectator magazine when he wanted to be leader, for example, that he was quite anti-lockdown. And now he's got to convince the inquiry that he wasn't as anti-lockdown as he might have come across in that interview. So it's tricky for him.
It is, and that is an interesting point, because I've listened to as much as I've been able to this morning of Rishi Sunak, and he's equivocating over his role in terms of perhaps trying to influence the Prime Minister when it came to issues like lockdown, how sceptical he actually was, and whether there were competing interests in terms of the economy and health. He's trying to say, no, there weren't.
Is he?
I mean, he is a little bit trying to say they were both equal, and although he was trying to represent the economy, he wouldn't like to say that it was more important.
That it was a trade-off. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see whether the inquiry actually does do what I'd like an inquiry to do, which is really say, well, OK, at the time, maybe people were making decisions with very little evidence, sometimes more than they made out, but they were trying to make policy on the hoof. But now, with hindsight, we should be able to look and say, OK, well, what were the effects of different policies? You know, if another thing hits, which it may well do at some point, what are the things we should say, well, actually, we could do this and it would have a great impact on infection and not have too much of a terrible impact on society. But I fear we're not getting that. I fear we are getting a finger-pointing, blaming individuals, instead of saying, well, let us now we're not actually facing a crisis like this, say, these were the downsides of lockdown. And, it is emerging. There were some very severe downsides. There's reports coming out now saying the impact on especially more deprived families. Not just the economy, but just the fabric of society. I think the way we interact as people has never really recovered from being told to stay apart from each other and view everybody with mistrust.
Well, let's have a look at the headline on the Eat Out to Help Out. It says, COVID inquiry has already decided Eat Out to Help Out was harmful, Sunak allies claim. Do you agree with that? Do you think it was harmful, Catherine?
I think it's really important to respect the inquiry. I think it's very important to families who suffered loss, who suffered loss of loved ones, who suffered loss of businesses, time with loved ones. And I think it's really important that we let the inquiry do its job in its entirety. And I appreciate as day-to-day events occur, there's a particular focus on individuals. But actually, I think we need to take it in the whole and respect the role of the inquiry, which was set up to look at it in the round. But I think the difficulty people find is that it keeps exposing the chaos that was at the heart of government during the COVID pandemic. And I think that's very distressing to watch, because as somebody who, was a parliamentarian during that time at home, but we did our very best to represent the concerns of constituents. And we had fears that there seemed to be chaos, but actually it's exposing it at a much greater extent than even we feared at the time. And I think it's also important that we recognise that it is exposing Rishi Sunak's poor judgment on a number of fronts. I mean, he broke the rules, we know that, but he appears to have failed to take scientific evidence before imposing quite significant economic measures. So I think the inquiry will show in the round what has happened, but I think it brings more concerns about what happened during the pandemic even than we had at the time.
What do you say to what Catherine says about Rishi Sunak's judgment in terms of a number of schemes? Presumably you don't mean furlough, but you do mean eat out to help out.
I think he had a hugely difficult job to do when you shut a country down. It's going to have consequences, and he's obviously at the time as was the Chancellor, and his job was looking after the economy, so he had to fit that with obviously all the other issues that all the other ministers were dealing with, so it was extremely difficult. I mean, in hindsight it's always easy to look back and say we could have done things differently, but I hope through this inquiry, the one thing this inquiry should do is do all it can to put a procedure manual together. So if this ever happens again, we've actually got something to look at, to work on, and take us forward the best way that we can. Now, every infection is going to be different, we know that, but at least if we've got a good manual there, that's what you would do in business, so that's what I hope comes out of this. If it just ends up being a blame game, then it's a complete waste of time, money, and it's hurtful for the people that have lost loved ones. We need something good to come out of this, and a manual there helping us, showing us how to proceed next time if it happens again would be well worthwhile.
I agree, it does have to be in the interests of people who lost their loved ones, but also of making sure we have government that functions. And one of the things that concerns me are the missing WhatsApps from both the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak. If they have nothing to hide, why haven't they been presented as part of the inquiry? And also, I think the other issue that we really need to look at is all of the fraud that occurred during the pandemic. We know there's £7.2 billion of COVID fraud, that and only 2% of it is being currently pursued, when it was promised by government that they would claw that back. That's money that should be in our public services and back in public hands, and I'd like to see more focus on that as well.
All right, well, let's stick with Eat Out to Help Out, because it was a key scheme that was introduced by Rishi Sunak. It has come in for quite a lot of criticism from witnesses who said they didn't even know about it, and it led to mixed messaging in terms of mixing and social distancing. But let's speak to a business owner, Amanda Rimington-Cross, cafe owner from Essex. She has a different view. Amanda, what did you think of Eat Out to Help Out?
Hi. Well, I was all for it. We're a small cafe. We rely heavily on footfall traffic. And then obviously, as soon as the pandemic hit and we were closed down, that all stopped. I had to drive everywhere to find customers, to deliver them my pancake boxes. And Eat Out to Help Out, it brought everyone back. It was just a crucial lifeline for us.
And crucial for your business?
Yeah, completely. I mean, it meant that I could start paying some of my bills. It meant I could employ people again. It meant that the whole area that we're on is full of independent cafes, restaurants and small retail shops. So the whole area benefited from it. With everyone out and about again. So, well, I mean,
interesting. Just stay with us for a moment, Amanda. I mean, Catherine, listening to that, do you think that hindsight has played a big role here? It has been criticised. There's debate over how much it contributed to spreading the virus as such. But at the time, it lifted the mood for many people, never mind saving businesses.
Yeah, and I remember how difficult it was for businesses during that period. And, and we were being contacted by businesses all the time, particularly, and also self-employed people who were really, really really concerned about the impact of COVID. But I think that's why this inquiry is so important, that it needs to be looking around. There are obviously things that may have seemed good at the time that in hindsight are not. There may have been things that looked disastrous at the time that were the right decision. The evidence needs to come to the fore, and we need to look at it as a whole inquiry and take a view.
But Amanda, you haven't changed your mind, have you? With hindsight, you still feel it was a good scheme?
I do. I think people had the option to stay home if they felt that was the best thing for them and for their friends and for their family. But those people that felt it was time to get out there, they came and they took advantage of it. So, yeah, I'd say it was a good thing.
All right. Amanda Remington-Cross, thank you very much. Tamandra, listening to that, do you think we need to hear more from people like Amanda, just as a counter, just as a different viewpoint, perhaps, to what was going on in SAGE or the viewpoint of some of the scientists afterwards?
Well, yes. I mean, I do think... I think the inquiry is very heavily, and I don't know if this is going to carry on throughout, which I fear it may, it's very heavily geared to was enough done to prevent the spread of the virus without looking very much at the bigger picture, which is now, really having a long-term impact. But I also think that, as well as hearing the voice of individuals, we should be looking at data and information, because we can now look and say, what was the economic impact, what are the economic downsides? I mean, things like the way humans interact in society is much more intangible. You can't. But there's a lot of stuff. There is data now. There is evidence, and also there are other countries that we can compare our experience with. It's never a perfect comparison, but you can very broadly say, well, maybe other countries had slightly different policies. Can we look at the impact of that? So that, I mean, I think it's a very engineering thing to say, no, we shall have a book and this will tell us, because these things are always political. They're about individual attitudes to risk. I mean, the good thing about the Eat Out to Help Out was, as she said, you didn't have to. You didn't have to go and eat out if your family was particularly vulnerable.
But it was about messaging. Was there mixed messaging coming out from the government?
I think that was deliberate. I think part of the messaging was actually, the risk, if you're not in a particularly high-risk group, the risk to you at the moment from COVID is quite low. You shouldn't be as fearful as you are, because I think, which of course they had previously said, everybody stay home or you'll die. So I think, having slightly overdone the fear messaging, they were now trying to go, no, it's fine, go out and eat.
So I think one thing that's being lost here, and I speak from a particular perspective because I was actually having to shield during the virus because I was having cancer treatment. The impact on individuals, as Tamandra says, is very, very different depending on what your individual circumstances. And there was a trade-off, and I think we should probably be a bit more honest about that to protect the hospitals and to protect people who were unwell. Others had to make a lot of sacrifices. And I think the degree is how much were those sacrifices the right ones, and will we do it again to that extent? But, we're not differentiating between before and after the vaccine arrived, because the judgments that should have been made once people were able to be vaccinated, and once particularly vulnerable people were able to be vaccinated, should perhaps have been different. But pre-vaccination, it was a genuine threat. And at the beginning, of course, we didn't really know enough about the virus to know who was at risk. We didn't at the beginning know that children wouldn't particularly be at risk from the virus, for example. Once we knew the pattern of the virus...
We knew that quite early. It was very early on. We knew the age.
I know, but children don't live on their own. They live with adults.
That's the thing.
And that was a lot of discussion about schools staying open or closing. I mean, this report in the Daily Mail, it's from the Centre for Social Justice. This is the report on it, looking at the effects of lockdowns on society. It's an interesting point, people remembering pre- and post-vaccination arrival. But lockdowns blew open a yawning social chasm in the UK. Do you agree with that, Catherine?
So I think it really highlighted those jobs that people do that we all rely on, and we realised we still rely on them even though there's a pandemic. And if you're able to work from home on your computer, and by definition in probably a higher paid role, you are working from home, and then other people who were running our public transport, running our health service, working in shops, we're all just as exposed as anybody. And I think the other thing about the Eat Out to Help Out was the fact that it wasn't just customers that could make a decision about whether they wanted to take a risk or not. Staff had to staff those restaurants. And I remember that being a big challenge for businesses when in the middle of the height of this, that actually just running a restaurant was a big challenge because you would have staff going down with COVID. And obviously then, you know, people do live, they don't live, everyone doesn't live necessarily on their own. They may live with family and they may also rely on grandparents for childcare. And that was one of the things that I think became really stark during, and which I hope is a lesson learned through this inquiry, the way families are structured and the way communities are structured, and that we really learn from that and recognise the value of different roles that people play in society and how much we relied on them and had, I think in many ways, taken them for granted.
I think that's really important. I mean, Sweden is often held up as the example of where, you know, social control was minimal. Sweden has more than 50% single occupancy households. That's not at all...
It's a different makeup.
Yeah, it's a
here.
totally different makeup in society. And we know that the postcodes that were worst hit by COVID deaths were ones with multi-generational households. So we have to look in a lot more detail before making generalisations about what can have a deleterious effect on society, I think.
I mean, what do you think, Nick, about this report? We're talking to Ian Duncan-Smith tomorrow here on Politics Live. He set up the Centre for Social Justice, which has done this report that the sort of social, societal divide was blown open and worsened by lockdowns.
Obviously, something like COVID is going to have an effect on lots of different people from all different backgrounds. Just going back to the Eat Out to Help Out and the way that we've just been discussing there, I think when the state comes in and takes control of everything and it pays everybody's wages and it tells everybody what to do, then each individual loses that personal responsibility themselves. And I think if we were going to look at it again, and I hope this inquiry will do that, it'll say, look, if if you are in good health and you're not going back to a home where there's people that are vulnerable, then we should get out there. And it's same with the young children. I mean, we should have done everything that we can to keep children in school, as long as we are not going to create issues with the teaching staff. And as I say, if they're vulnerable, but we need to look after those. But I think the worst thing that we can do for people is keep them apart, and we need each other. Community works together when people come together. But and unfortunately, that's what COVID did.
Do you think a government will be able to lock down society in the way it did during the COVID pandemic?
I think
again?
It would struggle to do that again. Right. I genuinely do believe it would struggle.
What strikes me and what is brought back in terms of fairly traumatic memories of that period was that utter disconnect between government and people and their lives. And I remember I was chair of the Petitions Committee, bringing petitions on childcare, on scans, on hospital visits, on maternity, and the government just seemed to live in an alternate reality to the one that people were facing. And I think that's what we need to make sure this inquiry prevents ever happening again.
All right, and we're going to keep an eye across Rishi Sunak's evidence at that inquiry. Meanwhile, not very far away, dozens of Conservative backbenchers are meeting inside the Palace of Westminster, chewing over the Rwanda plan to send asylum seekers there, even if they arrive on our shores by small boat. Let's have a look at this Guardian headline. Rishi Sunak faces crunch week. The vote is tomorrow. Tory factions prepare to debate Rwanda bill. Let's talk to Hannah Miller, political correspondent who's outside Portcullis House for us. What's actually happening and who's at this meeting, Hannah?
So we've seen around 20 or so MPs go into this meeting this afternoon, the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman among them. In that sense, they're not necessarily huge in number at this point, but they're clearly trying to capture the narrative by getting their assessment of this legislation out there before anyone else. They're led by the MP Sir Bill Cash, the Star Chamber that is. That's essentially a fancy name for a group of legal experts who have been put together by the right-wing ERG faction of the Conservative Party. And he wrote over the weekend, Sir Bill Cash, that he doesn't think that the government policy as it stands will meet its own objectives. It seems like there are potentially two key issues. One of them is what happens if the courts decide that a plane should not be allowed to take off to Rwanda. And the second is the fact that the legislation as it stands at the moment allows some asylum seekers to make their own individual appeals against being deported. The government's expected to publish its own legal advice later this afternoon, and this is really becoming a battle of the lawyers and the factions within the Conservative Conservative Party that in many ways is reminiscent of the Brexit days. Remember, the ERG were one of the key players in blocking Theresa May's Brexit deal and bringing down her government. So the danger that they could pose to Rishi Sunak is clear.
Yes, they're not the only group, and it is reminiscent of the Brexit days. There is the One Nation group of Conservatives meeting later on, and of course they're on the other side of this whole debate.
Yes, a more centrist group of MPs who are concerned, as you say, from a completely different perspective. They are worried basically that the government can't just suddenly declare that Rwanda is a safe country where they can send people. Now, we should be clear that the MPs who attend these meetings on either side, they will all make their own individual choices. They won't necessarily vote as a bloc, but they essentially face three options. One is to vote for the legislation when it goes before Parliament tomorrow and perhaps try to make changes further down the line, which could get Rishi Sunak off the hook at this stage, but pose a problem in the new year. They also could abstain. That would be a problem if enough of them choose to do that, or they could vote against it. But the fact that we're even talking about this at this stage in the passage of legislation through Parliament shows how controversial this is within the Conservative Party and the battle that the government really has on its hands.
Hannah Miller, thank you very much. Well, Nick, you are on the group on the right of the party, one or two of them. Are you going to back the legislation tomorrow?
I would have thought so, yes. Obviously, I'll be listening to what colleagues have got to say on this. It's important that we do get those planes off. The reason why we want to do that is because we want it to be a deterrent to stop people coming over on these boats. I was elected in 2019. I was elected on the Brexit vote, and to make sure that our country is sovereign, so we are in control of our borders. So we must do everything that we can.
Right.
Now, if the bill can work, then that's wonderful. I'll back the bill. If the bill needs amendments to make sure that it works, then same again. I will back the bill. If they come back and say that there's no way that it can work, amendments aside, then obviously that's going to be difficult for me to back, because my electorate sent me down here to make our country sovereign and to protect the borders and to reduce immigration and stop the boats.
Right, so, but at the moment, you will vote in favour of the legislation tomorrow. You believe the government when they say it's watertight legally. It will minimise, if not completely stop, any legal challenge.
Well, we've got a bill, so we've got something to work with.
All right.
The Prime Minister's come forward and says it will stop 99% of these immigrants, and this is what we want.
Right. Catherine, what do your constituents think about this bill?
Well, you said it reminds you of Brexit, and I see some of the similarities, but the difference here is that this isn't the country dealing with a major constitutional change. This is the Conservative Party fighting amongst themselves, which is very different. And I think...
But do your constituents... My question is, do your constituents think it is as important as Nick says his do?
So I'm not sure where this sense that the sending asylum seekers to Rwanda is the most important aspect for our constituents. What I know they care about is well-run public services and a country that works. And at the moment, we have a situation where we have 56,000 people being housed in hotels at a cost of £8 million a day. We have an asylum system that is not processing any of these claims. We have people arriving.
It is processing some of them now.
Not in the number that they need to be dealt with. And we have £300 million spent on a policy that will not work. And the reason they're arguing about the detail in terms of whether this particular bill will work, but fundamentally, this policy will not work to solve the problem.
Do you think the idea of having
at source,
right,
you need to
but do you think the idea of a deterrent is the right one? Is having a deterrent trying to put people off coming here?
So we don't believe it'll work. Labour's position is we want to spend the money that's been spent on the Rwanda policy.
Have voted 70 times against every single piece of legislation that we've put forward. If Labour get in, you will open the borders. This country will be completely.
No, so let's
it
deal
will,
in-
it will be
let's deal in-
teamed. It will be teamed with
let's
people
deal
coming
in
from
facts.
all the different other countries that are coming here.
Let's deal
And
in
unfortunately,
facts.
you'll ignore your electorate like you always have done. That's the problem that we had with Brexit. That's the problem that we're having now.
Okay.
We need to listen to the people that put us here, and the people who put us here have said we've had enough of immigration at this moment in time. Our country is full. Our services are struggling. Our housing is struggling. Our schools are struggling.
All right, well, let
Because
Catherine
of all the
respond.
immigration.
If I just come in with a few facts. The facts are that we have an asylum system that is just not working, and it needs to be invested in. You need to tackle the issue at source. You need to get we have a plan to invest in border patrol. Can I just finish?
Let her finish.
Nick, can I just finish? I'll let you speak. We also have a plan to invest in a returns
We've done that with Albania.
scheme. Well, yes, and we will build on that to make sure that we have asylum cases processed, that where people are legal to stay, they can get on with their lives. Where they're not, they can be returned.
All right, Catherine,
we need to invest the money that's being wasted currently, because the fact is the Rwanda plan, even as it's currently drafted, has a cap on it of 100, and it will be a drop. It'll be a drop in the ocean.
All right. Well, the idea, of course, is
it
is supposed to be a deterrent, so you wouldn't need to send as many people. But so far, it hasn't worked.
But
No planes have taken off.
Cost 50 million a year on top of the amount we're already
The government's spending a lot more on it. Hang on. But Catherine, the question people might say is, if an asylum seeker comes here and cannot be returned to the country of their origin, like Iran, for example, and Labour were in power and you didn't have the Rwanda scheme, where would that person go?
Well, we would invest in processing these claims, making sure we don't have this enormous backlog. The immigration system is just broken under this government, just like most of our public services. They have been underinvested in, and they are a victim of the chaos of this government that we've seen through COVID, through Brexit, now through this, which they have pinned all their hopes on convincing the electorate that they are getting a grip, but all they're doing is fight amongst themselves, and it's not solving the problem or tackling the issue at source.
And this is the substance, of course, of what has been discussed ad infinitum by a government that's wanted to discuss it. It talks about it all the time, so a lot hinges on this. The politics, though, Miranda, are absolutely critically important for Rishi Sunak. Tomorrow's vote is key. It's not the end of the line, of course, for this legislation, nor necessarily for Rishi Sunak.
No, indeed, but he only needs 29 of his own MPs to rebel, to lose the bill. But my feeling is, also from listening to Nick, but from the sort of whispers around the place, that it might get through tomorrow on the basis that the bill can then be amended. But that's not the end of the problem for Rishi Sunak, because he's got to get this bill through Parliament, not just through the Commons, which means it needs to go to the House of Lords. There are a lot of lawyers in the House of Lords. They're going to find it very tricky there. You could end up with weeks, if not months, of ping-pong, backwards and forwards. And while that's going on, Rishi Sunak looks increasingly weak, and he looks as if he can't deliver on this promise about the Rwanda scheme, which he personally has made totemic. That's the issue. The public do care about immigration. It's in the top 3 salient issues at the moment. It's been creeping up and up and up. But they don't like the Rwanda plan. And I think the political mystery here, in a way, is why the Prime Minister personally has made everything rest on this one scheme, which has all the drawbacks that Catherine has outlined, rather than taking a broader look at illegal immigration. Because, you know, having a change of Home Secretary from Suella Braverman to James Cleverly could have been a fresh start on this. But when James Cleverly said, well, Rwanda is one of the things that we're looking at to solve the problem,
not the be-all and end-all.
That was kind of slapped down, and it went back to everything's got to be about this Rwanda scheme. So he's made a rod for his own back. It's really hard how, in time, with the general election coming, he can get out of this hole.
Why is it so important to Mandra, this idea, as Nick says, of protecting our borders, of being a nation state that can make those sorts of decisions? Because the government can make those decisions. Illegal immigration, of course, is difficult with people coming across the channel, but the rhetoric around being able to protect one's borders seems to be so high on people's lists of priorities.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think sovereignty, which is sometimes scoffed about, but it's a genuinely important idea, because you know, if you frame it as self-determination, perhaps it sounds a bit more fluffy and liberal, but it is the idea that the citizens of a country should decide the political future of that country, and supposedly democracy in Parliament is the means by which we do that in majority choices, and controlling who gets to come to a country and who gets to also be a citizen is an important part of that. But there's also, I think, a very practical side, which is that as the population grows, as people come here, public services and things like housing are not expanding at the same rate. So, and particularly the people at the bottom of the pile who don't have maybe private healthcare or private education are seeing the services that are available to them get worse, and perceiving, even if it's not necessarily true in their local area, but perceiving that they are now competing for those services with people who sometimes have been brought in to do low-paid jobs, or people who have come in working on the grey economy. And so I think there's a very practical side to it as well. But I think the principle that the people who decide who comes to a country are the citizens of that country is important. You know, I love going to America, but I have to have a visa or a visa waiver to go there. That's fair enough. That's what the citizens of America decide, right? I'm not going to argue with that. That's what the Americans decide. And as someone who's not an American citizen, I have no right to quibble with that.
Right, but what you agree with all of that? Yeah, but why then make the Rwanda scheme tackling the small boats such a totemic issue? If in terms of numbers, you're talking about legal migration, which is the government's and in the government's hands, at 745,000 compared to 40,000. So why? What was the political benefit?
I think genuinely that we are a welcoming country, and if we need people to help us with certain parts of the economy, then that should be it. Although I genuinely do believe that we should be training many more of our own. But the people coming over on the boats, they're mainly single young men. They are leaving a country just like ours. People go to France on holiday. They are not leaving the countries that they're supposedly escaping from. They're leaving France and they're coming here. And people don't like to be taken advantage of. And these people that are coming here on these boats are taking advantage of our goodwill. And it's not on. It's just not fair. And we need to stop it. And just be with me, it's not just the Rwanda scheme. We've dealt with Albania. We've given France the extra money to help police those borders. Everything that the Labour Party come up with, we've already done. It's easy when you're not in government to say all these things. When you're in government, it's a different matter. We're doing everything that we can. I want the people of Doncaster to know that I'm doing everything that I can to support this government to stop them boats. It's hugely important. That's what I was sent down here for, and I will continue to do it.
I think any MP that has constituents who contact them about anything to do with the Home Office will know that the job is just not getting done in our Home Office. It's chaos. And we see, absolutely right, we are not training enough people here in the UK to do the jobs that we need, which is why many people are coming to the country to work. And we're not processing the claims that we have. We've got this enormous backlog. Labour was left with an enormous backlog from the former Conservative government, and we dealt with it, we processed it, we let people either get on with their lives or dealt with what needed to happen next, and we will do it again in government. We will get this immigration system back under control.
I mean, the other group, the One Nation Conservatives, because they are the other part of the Conservative Party who are looking at the bill and are very keen that it doesn't go any further. Rishi Sunak has said it is the toughest immigration legislation we've had, and I think that's probably right, because they don't want to breach any of the UK's international obligations. Do you think in the end they'll be the ones who are disappointed?
It could be, because, you know, I mean, Nick talks about a deterrence. It seems to me this whole Rwanda argument is a kind of deterrent against making undeliverable promises, actually. But you're quite right, the centre ground of the Tory party is very suspicious of the bill for kind of rule of law reasons and for human rights reasons. And that's also important. I mean, I take very seriously what Tamandra said about sovereignty, but you know, in a liberal democracy, the rule of law is also really important, and so are human rights. They go together. Otherwise, you end up with a journey towards a kind of Hungary Viktor Orban situation where, because you have a democratic mandate, you can override any other considerations about the political culture that we live in. So I think for the centre, the left, as it were, of the Tory party, those considerations are as important as those sovereignty considerations on the right of the Tory party. Sunak's stuck in the middle with this bill, and it's like the charge of the Light Brigade, you know, because there's fire from both sides. And I think he's in a really, really difficult spot.
And I think the fact is that this whole Rwanda, we've been on this 2 years now. We're on Bill 3. We've had more Home Secretaries go to Rwanda than asylum seekers. And it's all about an internal Conservative Party drama about holding on to power and fighting amongst themselves as to how they can best achieve that. The country deserves better.
What do you say to the One Nation Tories who are beginning to suspect that actually this legislation may be in danger of breaching international obligations, and they may be the ones that find that they can't support it?
I just want to go back to what Miranda said first. I do believe the Rwanda plan will work. You wouldn't buy a ticket to go to Paris and if you knew you was going to end up in Rwanda, and that's exactly what we're doing the other way around here. I think the factions in the party are nowhere near as big as what the media say they are.
Really?
Obviously, well, I genuinely don't believe that they are. I see all my colleagues on a daily basis, and I speak with them on many different issues. Obviously, we need to. We need a plan that everyone can get behind.
Well, is that likely, though? Is there really a plan that everyone's going to... Because if one side likes it, the other side doesn't.
We need to look at what's actually happening across the country in places like Doncaster, not in these leafy suburbs. We need to actually look at what's happening in places like Doncaster when you've got HMOs with 9, 10 people living in them. You've got services that are stretched. You've got A&E, which is stretched. We've got...
Money being wasted on this.
We've got 12, you know what I mean? We've got 12-hour waiting lists. And because we've got people who are turning up there who can't speak English, which is difficult. We've got schools, which we've got young children in schools, and then their time is from the teacher is being minimised because they've got children there that are speaking. So we need to keep tight on the amount of people that are coming in this country, so that we can actually serve the country, which is what we're meant to do. And the One Nation Tories, I know they're decent people, and we just need to all work together towards doing what's best for the country. And what's best for the country is to have controlled immigration at a low level.
Let me just show you this, because, as I say, they've all been meeting, the groups to the right of the party. Nicholas Watt, Newsnight's political editor, says the Star Chamber is the sort of quasi-legal group within the Conservative Party looking at the legislation, says government's emergency legislation only provides a partial and incomplete solution. Well, that only gives us a partial and incomplete view of what they're going to do. What do you think?
Because, as Nick's explained, they might pass it and then hope to amend it later on if they think it's incomplete.
All right. Well, look, just before we go, if you've been watching I'm a Celebrity, you will know that the former UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, came third. I haven't been watching it myself, but I have read it in the papers. He was interviewed about a possible comeback to frontline politics. Let's have a little look at what he said.
As to whether I have a future in politics, I have no idea at this moment in time. But what I would say is never say never. And our country needs, actually, people at the top with some firm guidance as to where we're going to go in the future.
What do you make of that, Nick? I'll show you this headline in the Times. Sunak leaves door open to Nigel Farage to join the Tories. Would you welcome him to the Conservative Party?
Yes, why not? He can come and stand in Doncaster Central and stand with me. If that's what he wants to do, then that's great. Nigel Farage knows exactly how I feel, well, how he feels about immigration. I feel about the same way.
All right. Catherine, would you welcome him back into frontline politics?
So in that very short clip that you put there, I noticed he said "I" 4 times, and I think it's all about Nigel, really. The last I saw of him, he was being welcomed back into the Conservative Party conference. So, you know, if that's the way the Conservative Party wants to go, but I don't think it has no interest for me.
Interest for you?
He taps into something. I have friends and family who are big Farage fans, and I think what they feel is that most politicians don't listen to people like them, don't care what people like them think, and Farage does. And he's one of those odd people who's not particularly common himself, but is relatable and feels like a normal bloke, even though he probably isn't. So I think if he wanted to go back into politics, he would find a big audience.
What do you think? Do you think he will come back or try and come back into frontline politics? I mean, he stood, 7 times? And hasn't got... He's never won. Of course, he was an MEP.
Yeah, but if you're Nigel Farage, you've proved that you don't have to win an election to have an enormous impact on the history of the UK, right? Because it's because of Nigel Farage that the Tory party was pulled to the right on Europe. We had a referendum which David Cameron sort of accidentally lost, and here we all are. So his influence does not really rely on, getting himself into Parliament. But I think that, Reform UK are looking cheerful enough, Farage is back, to really spook the Tory party all over again.
Well, and on that note, we'll end the programme, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. Rishi Sunak, of course, the Prime Minister, is continuing to give evidence at the COVID inquiry. We'll have more of that tomorrow. From all of us here, bye-bye.
Witness spectacular